What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 13 Cash Game Review Show. I am TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 444.com, as always with my co-host Matt Savoca. Before we get into the Cash Game Review today, just want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, the most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. Their brand new Pick'em game is available. Just pick over or under on your favorite or your least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you can take home some cold hard cash. Head to 444.com/underdog to claim your free Pro 444 subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend on Underdog. Matt, how was your week 13, sir?
It was good. And you know what? This week is really interesting in the fact that it's a reminder that every week is its own little puzzle, because the news made this one really difficult and the values were different than we typically see. So it ended up going okay. I ended up with that Sony Michel and that late Darrell Henderson active news kind of hedging my bets a little bit. And so I did split my cash lineups a little bit. One just moving away from Sony Michel entirely, but leaning on the Rams passing game. And one with my general plan going into the weekend, which included Lamar Jackson and a couple of other pieces that I ended up moving around. If you want to throw that first lineup onto the screen, you'll see it up there. I ended up going with the 3 value running back build, Sony Michel being the easiest one, obviously. If you just ignore all the announcements from about 3 p.m. Eastern on, this is what you would probably end up with, or something similar to a high-price quarterback in either Lamar Jackson or in Tom Brady, or going all the way down to a player like Gardner Minshew. 3 or 2 value running backs, depending on whether you decided to play Jonathan Taylor or not, and then a ton of Cooper Kupp in there, and George Kittle as well. So this was pretty chalky ultimately, but the players that we were relying on hit in big ways. Kupp has a great day. George Kittle has an absolutely insane day. The Dolphins defense doesn't disappoint. Lamar Jackson does okay, but not great. It was really how he did compared to Tom Brady, which really defined how you did in these cash games. But ultimately, what I ended up doing with the Darrell Henderson active news is hedging my bets and saying, I'm pretty sure that this is one of those fake actives. And this is where Darrell Henderson is available for emergency purposes only. But just in case I'm really wrong here, I'm going to lean in to the Rams stack here and go with the Matthew Stafford, keep Cooper Kupp, and go with Odell Beckham. So it was kind of wild in those late swap hours, but it ended up going okay. A positive ROI day for me.
Yeah, it was interesting because with the Sony news, not only was he just in a unique salary tier on both sites, but so many of the big values on the week, especially Gibson, Kupp, Renfro, even whatever tight end you were playing was on the late slate. So there was lots of maneuverability depending on what happened with Sony, if you were going to play Sony or not. But at the same time, there were a ton of running back values. So there were lots of options to go with at running back. And before we get to that point and your 3 running back build and your thoughts around that, I mean, you talked about Lamar and Tom Brady. Anybody that plays specifically on DraftKings might not realize Minshew wasn't even the top value in 444 at quarterback. Lamar Jackson and Tom Brady were our top 2 values, just because those top end quarterbacks on FanDuel are so much easier to get to from a relative salary perspective. They often are going to grade out better even than a player like Minshew, who is near the minimum salary here, $6,100 on FanDuel. So is there anything that from this lineup, I know you said you played 2 lineups, but from this lineup that besides the decisions that you talked into, that you were just kind of like locked into, even besides the Michelle news?
Yeah, so besides that, I was sticking with Cooper Kupp unless there was a specific head-to-head reason why I knew I needed to switch away from him. So I didn't end up switching away from him really in any lineups, which was ultimately a great decision. And Deontay Johnson, I know he was coming up in our value rankings similar to players like Keenan Allen, who also hit, but he was one of my lock plays. I've been talking him up all the time on the DFS MVP show. Basically, with the target volume he's receiving, if the touchdown upside were different on his offense, and there is variability from week to week in that regard, he would just be a totally different salary player. So I've been locking him in recently. And then Kittle was a lock as well. You don't expect it to go as well as it does, but I was not moving away from him unless, again, I had something go terribly awry in the 1 p.m.s. And Jamal, he does fine, Williams, but not so much that I felt like I needed to move away or get way off the board in my late swaps.
Yeah, Kittle was another interesting one on FanDuel because he was probably my favorite tight end play of the week before we got the news that Gardner Minshew was starting. I ended up liking Goddard a lot more. But on FanDuel, again, a lot of people might not realize if they were only playing DraftKings how good of a value Kittle was compared to where everybody's playing Moreau on DraftKings, which we'll get to. Kittle was our top value tight end at 6,300. $700 cheaper than Gronk, $1,000 cheaper than Mark Andrews. It was just a smash play for Kittle with Deebo Samuel being out. I guess the only one that we really haven't talked about, I mean, Hunter Renfrow was pretty much one of the best wide receiver values as well. But Keenan Allen, that's what did you end up playing him in the other lineup? Do you want to move to
I
that
didn't.
lineup? Okay.
Yeah, let's move over to that lineup. And, we can call this some misses or really the decision point was, do you play Keenan Allen early or Deontay Johnson late?
Right,
And
yeah.
so I felt like they were very similar values, very similar salary ranges, obviously. So ultimately, it was one of those toss-ups where I felt comfortable just keeping the optionality for the late swap. So I ended up leaning on Deontay Johnson where possible. I obviously switched off of him in this build here because I moved up from Sony Michel to Elijah Mitchell. In case it was possible that Darrell Henderson was actually active, I wanted the availability of all of those touches going to Elijah Mitchell. And I felt comfortable just capturing a ton of the overall volume in the San Francisco and Seattle game, specifically in the San Francisco side of things. I made a decision early on in the week that if it came to playing Elijah Mitchell and George Kittle, I was absolutely fine doing that, basically because Kittle was a lock play. So while I don't, it wasn't outrageous value for Matthew Stafford. His 24 points is actually, pretty good, not great. And Odell Beckham saves his day with a touchdown. I feel like the process giving the news here was solid, just leaning into that Rams smash spot, not moving away from it entirely, but just moving away from the running game.
Yeah, that was my question. I mean, when you go to this lineup without Michelle, was the Beckham choice just kind of that? I mean, we only had two teams projected for as many points as the Rams or the or the Buccaneers. Was it just basically like if I'm not playing Michelle or if the running back if the backfield is kind of analogous or we don't really know what they're doing or if they're switching it up, you rather just get all the passing game points? Is that kind of the thought process?
That was exactly the thought process. The other thing is the only real other bell cow running back I felt comfortable going to if I wasn't going to Eli Mitchell and Antonio Gibson, I got to go all the way up to Najee Harris. And that really changes the build there. So I already felt like Hunter Renfrow was at the salary floor at his tier. If you go below his salary, you're dealing with another tier of wide receiver. So the most obvious place for me was to just lean into that passing attack, go down to Stafford, and include Odell Beckham. It was okay. This lineup finishes 45th percentile in a really, really high scoring day. In a normal day, we're thrilled with this score. It just happens to be a really high scoring game.
Yeah, so crazy. It's like 160 on FanDuel. Like that's usually like cashing relatively highly in GPPs, let alone like a 45 percentile score in cash games. It was a crazy week. One thing that I think was interesting with I mean on whatever site you were playing with so many values opening up, was there ever a consideration in going all the way up to somebody like a Jonathan Taylor?
Yeah, I agonized over it. I really thought that, especially once quarterback value opened up at the very bottom of the salary pool, that it might just be time to go with Gardner Minshew, Cooper Kupp, Jonathan Taylor, and let the optimizer fly.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time on Sunday morning going back and forth about this. Same structural build, 3 running backs. It would either be 2 value and Jonathan Taylor or 3 value. Honestly, what really ends up winning it all here is the 3 rock solid wide receivers that were available, because you could get to Kupp, Godwin, Jefferson, and Kittle in cash games because of the value at running back. So that's what just knocks things out of the park. But
Yeah.
for me, it was the decision point of whether to play Jonathan Taylor early or not.
Yeah, was Jefferson in your player pool? Because I mean, obviously he goes nuclear, but Madison is kind of the smash value in that game, and then Thielen gets hurt. Teams haven't been throwing a ton against the Vikings. I mean, obviously on DraftKings it was way different. I never really considered Jefferson as a cash game play. Was he someone that you even had in your pool?
He actually wasn't. But
Yeah,
we did talk about him briefly on the DFS MVP as one of the players who could compete with Cooper Kupp for wide receiver 1 overall.
Probably the only one on the slate, right?
Yeah. Yeah, him and Godwin, and they of course both live up to their salaries here. So no, it was a situation where I wasn't considering Jefferson over Kupp unless I was being contrarian. He was more for tournaments.
Yeah, was there anything else that that you were? I mean, there again, we mentioned there were a ton of values on this slate. We mentioned Madison briefly with Jefferson. David Montgomery was another one. Cardinals were interesting. Anything about any of those games or any other player pool notes that you had into consideration or that you might have put into your lineups?
Yeah, when I ran the consensus projections, Jamal Williams really popped for me when I added all the sites that I typically value. It looked really, really good. But I got to say, especially when we got the news that Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins were going to be active, I seriously considered the direct pivot to David Montgomery just because the offensive potential of that game completely changes. And you see it right from the get-go, right? Because Kyler and Hopkins hit for that long touchdown, then Kyler rushes it in. Suddenly, even if the Bears are sticking to their conservative game plan, they got to move the ball, they got to change their pace, as we talked about on the DFS MVP, and Montgomery gets there in a much better way than Jamal Williams. And they're clamoring that Jamal Williams' receiving game workload was not going to change.
Right.
And that's ultimately what we saw. We saw Jamar Jefferson involved, Igwebuike involved in the receiving game through the backfield. So I think if I had a little more time to think about it, I might have switched directly to David Montgomery.
Yeah, I mean, I actually probably didn't even consider that enough, and we'll talk about that game a little bit with my lineup. But having the game environment aspect with especially just with Kyler, even if Nuke isn't active, really does change the whole outlook of that game. So Montgomery is a guy that I kept looking at, but never. I didn't write him up and I didn't suggest him. But in retrospect, he's probably one of the better plays because of what you said, especially with the weather. Like the running games should have done well in that game, and they did on both sides. So I like that perspective a lot. Did you see anything in other lineups besides your own that really stood out to you in terms of being productive or in winning lineups?
Yeah, so Brady over Jackson or Brady over Stafford gives you an extra 5 points. That's massive on a week like this. So you saw a lot of Brady and a lot of Gardner Minshew at the top. Yep. As we said, it's a super high scoring week. The first 5,000 lineups of the $2 double up. It's just the biggest one that FanDuel offers, so I love to join it. The first 5,000 lineups had 175 plus FanDuel points. That's ridiculous. And you just saw that Minshew plus 3 value running back make the stud wide receiver build and Kittle really possible. That's what ultimately wins all the money. I think there was a 200-point score with like chalk players all over the place. So it was just kind of a wild week for FanDuel.
And you mentioned it briefly at the top, but the 3 running back build on both sites was very obvious in a week like this where we had where we just had value up and down at the position, and just when you have that many running backs projecting that well and salaries are open, like when we can jam in studs everywhere, I think that it almost always lends itself to a 3 running back build because we're not forcing like a marginal running back. So those weeks I think are always going to be 3 running back builds.
Yeah, totally agree. Again, volume is king in fantasy football. So we want cheap volume and then superstar value.
Right, exactly.
Really all it is.
Yeah, and that's really what we had on both sites. So let's move on over to DraftKings and look at the various the very obvious studs and duds build. And again, a week where 160 points, usually a pretty good score on DraftKings. This was only a 33rd percentile score on DraftKings this week, 161 DK points, which you just don't see that very often. I mean, even before the Minshew, Jalen Hurts news, I was pretty locked into most of my build. Again, we talked about that. We had 3 running backs pretty much locked in even before the Sony Michel news. So it was Foster Moreau, it was the value running backs, and for me, it was locking in Cooper Kupp. We talked about it for quite a bit on the Friday DFS MVP show, that the positional value of Cooper Kupp compared to the field was not even close. I mean, obviously Godwin and Jefferson outscore him. Jefferson benefits from Thielen being hurt, and then Godwin just has his ceiling game. Like, Kupp still gets there with 30 points, but like just the projection compared to the field, he was just lapping everybody, and it was probably the easiest high salary lock for me. Once we got the Jalen Hurts news on Saturday, Minshew automatically became my cash game quarterback on DraftKings at $4,000. Like, things were already pretty open, but it made getting to Alexander Madison and Godwin very easy, which I mean, those are 2 players that I was really looking at. I mean, with Antonio Brown still being out, with the Buccaneers coming off that game where they so much went to Fournette, but they were obviously going to be in a spot where they could move the ball very effectively against Atlanta. Atlanta was just they're such a slow team, and like I think it was on our podcast, like I kind of joked that maybe Tampa Bay could run like 80 plays, but like Tom Brady, he had 20 pass attempts in the first quarter with so much passing, something like that. Yeah, so I got once I got Minshew, it was really about like getting Godwin and Madison. Those were like 2 of my favorite players in cash games. So everything was pretty locked in for me from that standpoint.
Yeah, we're gonna have to look at these slot receivers against Atlanta because they're just getting roasted. Godwin had 15 targets. I believe he had 3 more targets than any other player on the slate. And also, you look at Gibson being an obvious play, over 75% of the field playing him. Moreau being over 80% of the field. We've talked about it before. In those situations, we're just locking it in. And honestly, the thing that surprises me most is that Minshew is under 40%. I figured he'd be even more popular.
Yeah, I think, and this was, like you mentioned, the ownership on the cash games, and it's something that, especially on DraftKings, where we have, like, these are even though it was a high scoring week, and I'll get to how I think about those weeks, I love the weeks where it's a very obvious build, because in my opinion, it's just like, let other people make mistakes. Now, I guess I end up making the mistake not playing Sony Michel, but Foster Moreau, 82%, Gibson, 77%, Cooper Kupp, 56%, Godwin, 54%. Minshew, like you said, 39%. So it was like the build I thought was very obvious. The big thing that you talked about was obviously that Sony Michel news. The way I thought about it, once I got the Minshew news, we had this very obvious build. We had a ton of running back value, and with like Eli Mitchell being 6 and Gibson being 5,700, moving down to Michel like didn't change my lineup from like an overwhelming perspective, because we already had very obvious pump plays in Moreau, in Minshew, and I was easily able to get up to Kupp and Godwin already. I guess my thinking was that like you said, if you did really read between the lines, it was that Darrell Henderson was just going to be an emergency active, and they did say he wasn't optimistic to play. I just didn't think it was going to be worth the risk of just trying to have to change my lineup at the 1 p.m. slot. When we did get, like, Henderson was declared active. Obviously, he wasn't used. Right. But I was just like, what's the point of having to play him if if there's a chance, like, if Henderson gets any of the work and like steals a touchdown or something, then you're really just throwing away all of this running back value that was already present on the slate. Obviously, all of the lineups that end up using him are the ones that end up doing very well, because you're able to, like, I guess the thing was, like, I guess I can get up to Jonathan Taylor, but I just don't know if I'm ever going that high when there's so many other running backs. I mentioned that I loved Kittle, but I just didn't know how to get off Moreau, because why not just punt that very high variance position? I was never gonna like flex a tight end or anything. It was an obvious 3 running back build. I think maybe I upgrade my defense, but that just doesn't feel like something I'm going out of my way to do. And speaking of defense, it was just like, who fit into this lineup? The Bengals were home favorites. Like, it wasn't a great spot, but
they had a defensive touchdown called back too, right?
Yeah. And I was like, the only other defenses in that range were the Raiders and Washington, and I was already playing Moreau and Gibson, so I didn't want to play defenses there. So I guess, in retrospect, it's a pretty big error not playing Michelle, but like, I don't know, people were, I mean, even you said that you played 2 different lineups because of it, but people were playing it like they were just so confident and they didn't care if they had to swap, like it wasn't a big deal. But then nobody swapped. Like, Henderson was active and nobody swapped. That was the weird thing to me.
I think that's really, nobody swapped because people don't swap is
exactly
what I think it was. So people got saved by the fact that they didn't change their lineups in this specific circumstance. And it actually leads right into why I ultimately made the decision to split my lineups in half, because I knew that if Michelle hits at that price and so many people have him, I'm going to have some sort of superstar effort from Kupp and Kittle. And you know what? They almost get there for me, but he's going to crush me if I don't have Michelle and he goes off for 25 points, which is exactly what he does. So that's why I split it down the middle. I think that I made the same logical progression in going to Eli Mitchell, and I'm looking at the DraftKings value rankings for 4 for 4. The way it ended up going is Mitchell was our top value play by the time it rolled around. So it makes perfect sense. Obviously, when a player that high owned at that low salary going for 25 plus points, that's going to really hurt in cash games.
Yeah.
But the rationale is sound.
Yeah, and that's and I mean, that's usually what we talk about in this space, and what I've really, especially on DraftKings, where we often end up with these like what should be obvious builds, and you just let other people make mistakes. You mentioned, like, if he goes off, he crushes you, or that lineup combination crushes you. With so, like, the rhetoric on late Saturday, early Sunday morning was like, play him, and then if you need to swap because Henderson is active, then you can. And then, in retrospect, the people that play him are saying like, oh, it was so obvious we played him and it works. I just didn't know that if you do play him, if you do get crushed, because I wasn't sure how I didn't know that many people were going to like play him and then just not do anything about it once we get Henderson active. I guess the takeaway is like when the sentiment is that strong, DFS players are typically going to be stubborn, right? Once they're like, oh no, he's going to be a play, they're going to convince themselves that he's going to be the play. So the 55% in cash games, I guess in my biased mind, is higher than it should be, but from how people are playing, I guess it does make sense that it is that high.
Here's an interesting question. If we get the Henderson active, if the game is at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we get the Henderson active news at 11:30 when the inactives come out, what do you think Michelle's ultimate ownership ends up? I think it's way lower, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably lower, and I think there's probably less like certainty going into Sunday because people can't like completely build their lineups, and then when the if the news drops, then it's just really easy to say like we still have time to build our lineups. I guess like there's probably just this mental thing where once 10 o'clock locks, people are just or 1 p.m. on the East Coast locks, people are just like, yeah, the game started, the lineups are locked in. So I don't know. It's a big error playing him. I'm not trying to justify the error. I think the conversation is just that understand what the industry is going to do a little bit better.
Yeah, we've talked about it a bunch. And maybe it really is just like an ownership thing. When we know the ownership's going to be that high, we're probably just going to play it, differentiate ourselves elsewhere.
Yeah, one thing that I probably didn't, and I could have done what you did and hedge a little bit, or play 2 lineups, or even just like play early only, which probably would have been the smart thing to do. Like have some early only, since Sony Michel was on the late slate. It just would have made way more sense. What I've really preached in the past, and I didn't take my own advice this week, is when we have these weeks where it gets to the point where you just kind of jam your studs. I've always kind of said that those are the weeks to dial back your overall money in play and dial back your percentage of allocation to cash. And this isn't because I had a bad week. This isn't retrospect at all. I've been saying this for years. The idea is that when there are these high scoring weeks and it just is what stud scores more, those are just naturally more high variance weeks. Like the edge in DFS is being able to understand values, understand positional allocation, understand where values come from and where to pay up or where not to pay up. When we get a week where you don't even have to think about that, any old person that has even heard the word DFS knows how to build a lineup. It just lets you play all of the best players, the best skill possession players at every position, and there's just going to be more overlap and variance in those weeks. So when we do have like just play as many studs as you want weeks, or play a lot of studs, those are weeks that we should dial back a little bit.
I dig it. I completely agree. I actually moved some of my action to the afternoon only slate because I love the games over there, and I was already prioritizing it so much in my main slate lineup. So same idea there. There was a ton of stuff that really shocked me in these games, though. The big thing that I saw that right off the bat was like the first 20 minutes of games, Keenan Allen scores twice for the first time in 3 seasons. I know we had him high in the value rankings. I just didn't have enough of him.
Yeah, I mean that game frustrated me for a lot of reasons, mainly because I had Joe Mixon everywhere in GPPs, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But yeah, Keenan Allen was really popping as a value, especially on FanDuel. So I mean, him going crazy early was expected from a volume standpoint, not exciting from a my lineup standpoint. But that game was pretty crazy. The Niner game was interesting how it played out.
I mean, we knew where the touches were going, right?
Yeah.
We knew that Kittle and IU definitely had to get more. And Mitchell does okay, but Kittle going absolutely bonkers. I mean, I think he was top in the NFL among tight ends in total yak, despite being on injured reserve for multiple weeks. And then he goes crazy, 103 yards after the catch in his 181 receiving yard game. That's bonkers. And I mean, they blow it at the end, which is just crushing. Yeah. But that game was really good. Honestly, those afternoon games, the Rams did what they needed to do for fantasy for you, but then they left early so that the rest of those afternoon games, we could watch those. They were excellent, all 3 of them.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit earlier about that Arizona game. I mean, one thing that I didn't mention in my lineup was I played Darnell Mooney, and once we had the weather there, I probably should have got off that, but he was still a good value, so I don't like kill myself for that play. But that game was a fun one to watch with Kyler back.
Yeah, I had almost none of them in GPPs, and I was saying I was going to get to them if they were active, and then 12 p.m. Eastern comes around, and there's that report that Hopkins didn't come out after the warm-ups, and then I started to swap away from him real fast, but then there's another tweet coming in saying, no, he just wants to stay out of the cold for an extra minute, and then he scores a 30-yard touchdown in 5 real-life minutes later. It was a wild one. Honestly, the Arizona team is just really fun. One of those teams that I hope makes it really far into January, because from a fantasy football and a real football perspective, I think them finally clicking with that Cliff Kingsbury air raid offense finally working and that defense being pretty considerably good, I think it's just good for football and the evolution of offense.
Yeah, I agree. On the other side, the evolution of the Baltimore offense going downhill, I was surprised how bad Lamar struggled against Pittsburgh. I did actually see just a couple tweets noting how the Steelers defensive coordinator has had some really good games against Lamar, but I thought this was a spot where he was going to get things right. He had struggled for a couple weeks. But I was talking with Matt Harmon on the Yahoo /4for4 podcast that we've just seen like a lot of dips from these really good players this year, and that should be expected to some extent. But the way Baltimore struggled looked like a cause for bigger concern, more of like something that might plague them for the season, like we've seen with KC, more than something like with the Bills where they've had a couple of hiccups, but it seems like they're still a very good team. So adjusting for the new Lamar, and I guess even for the new Kansas City, I mean, they keep showing up as like a team that is they keep projecting for a lot of implied points. They obviously weren't on the main slate, and the players keep projecting for huge values, but like the Chiefs and Baltimore, I think we're really going to have I think they're going to be an interesting team for the rest of the season, because they're probably going to keep projecting well. They're probably going to keep getting high implied point totals because of their name values, and like how much do we just keep fading them? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the last few weeks of the season.
You know, this is bad, TJ, because everyone's reeling. We have questions about every single elite offense except for Tom Brady's. I know they've had some down games, but it's mid-December. They're rolling. They're healthy. They're terrifying. And for all of us who would like to see something else occur in the NFL, I'm getting more and more concerned by the week.
Time is a flat circle. Any big overview DFS specific approach takeaways from this week?
I just want to reiterate your point to when we have uncertainty at this level, the biggest value running back is possibly still in play, but we're not sure with this Darrell Henderson, Sony Michel news. That is the perfect time to change your allocation to cash games. Yeah. When the game gets harder, don't spend as much money on it. Yeah. When we have more certainty on the value plays, that's when you lean into this cash game process. It's a game of uncertainty already. So when it's too uncertain, just lean into GPPs.
Yeah, I already talked about it. Just going through that news process, and I think like just we should all be playing more slates. You did a whole speech on it earlier in the year. I think that's probably just outside of the process. Play multiple slates every week, and then you're just always going to naturally hedge without being suboptimal. So I think more slates is my big takeaway this week.
Nice, yeah. And now we'll get that optimizer rolling for every single slate. No, I'm joking. Soon enough.
Yep. All right. Well, on to week 14. If you haven't signed up for 4 for 4 yet, our rest of season price is down to $24. You can use the promo code DFSMVP to get an additional 10% off, but $24 for the rest of the season. We go all the way through the Super Bowl. We got multiple slates coming up. We have Saturday slates coming up in a couple weeks, back-to-back Saturday slates. So we're going to have lots of opportunity to play multiple slates like we just talked about, and to get a ton of value out of that $24. Like, we still got a couple months of DFS, NFL DFS left, so let's keep this thing rolling. Thanks for watching us here on YouTube. Please like the 4 for 4 and YouTube channel and give it a follow, and make sure you're checking out our other DFS MVP shows. Every Friday is our full show going over all of our favorite values on FanDuel and DraftKings. That's at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube, and it comes out on the podcast feed as well. Every Saturday, the Yahoo DFS show with Matt Harmon. That comes out on both the DFS MVP and the Yahoo podcast feeds. And every Sunday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern time, the GPP Last Look show with Jordan Vanek. That is for 4 for 4 subscribers only. So make sure you sign up, like I mentioned, for that $24. Get access to our Discord channel where that show is. You could sign up for the Discord in the show notes below. And make sure you're following us all on Twitter. 4 for 4 is at 4 for 4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.